Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a question that's been kind of freaking me out lately.
Yeah.
It's like, what makes those authoritarian regimes rise up, and why does it seem so familiar every time? We're going to look at two leaders, Adolf Hitler back in the 1930s in Germany, and Fidel Castro over in 1950s Cuba. And hopefully we can figure out those creepy similarities.
You've got a really interesting history podcast lined up for us to unpack, by the way. It shows how fragile societies can be when things get messy, how easily they can just, I don't know, crumble.
It's scary how often it happens, right?
Yeah.
But look, we're not here to say one ideology is better than the other, not at all. This is about the step-by-step process of how these things happen, because it seems like history loves to repeat itself.
For sure. And it really hits you how, even with completely opposite ideologies, I mean, you've got the Nazis in Germany, total National Socialism versus the communists in Cuba, they somehow took eerily similar paths to power. It's kind of unsettling how unrest can be, like, manipulated and weaponized.
Like they were playing the same twisted game, just with different rules, right? So first things first, both Germany and Cuba were already kind of on the verge of a meltdown, primed for some kind of extreme change.
Yeah, you could say they were societies on edge. And it wasn't just about hardship. It's the way people make sense of it. You know what I mean? Like, take economic misery. That can totally wreck people's faith in their leaders, in the whole system. And suddenly, extreme solutions don't seem so extreme anymore.
And Germany really got hammered by the Great Depression. Imagine that 1930s Berlin, and a third of the people you see are out of work. The Weimar Republic, already shaky from the Treaty of Versailles, they were like the punching bag for all that suffering.
Yeah.
No wonder people wanted a way out, any way out.
It's like opening a dangerous door, you know? All of a sudden, those radical ideas, the ones that seemed impossible before, start sounding like the only way to survive.
And that's where Hitler steps in. He was a master at using that despair. He pointed the finger at scapegoats, often, and tragically, Jewish people, blaming them for all of Germany's problems. And by doing that, he offered this toxic but appealing solution, a return to national pride, to being strong again.
The oldest trick in the book, right? Find a common enemy, real or imagined, and offer up a simple solution, usually a hateful one.
Cuba wasn't much different, even if the problems weren't exactly the same. Extreme wealth inequality under Batista's dictatorship was the name of the game there. Imagine this American companies owning most of the important industries, while regular Cubans could barely afford basic necessities. Talk about simmering resentment, right?
And into this whole mess walks a young Fidel Castro, who is already deeply bothered by all this unfairness, even as a young man. Remember that famous "History will absolve me" speech he gave at his trial after the whole Moncada barracks attack? It shows you how he thought, even back then. He basically said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that revolution is justified when a government goes completely against what the people want. That's powerful stuff, and a lot of Cubans felt it.
It's crazy how both of these guys, despite their total opposite viewpoints, were amazing at taking that public anger and using it.
Yeah.
But they did it so differently.
Speaking of using anger, that's a key difference to point out. See, Hitler, he was working within an actual democracy, flawed as it was. He basically used the Weimar Republic's own system to destroy it from the inside out. Castro, on the other hand, he led a full-on revolution against a dictator who was already there.
So, different playing fields, but kind of the same playbook in the end.
In a way, yeah. Both of them knew how to use fear and propaganda, how to create this us versus them narrative. But the way they actually put those things into action, that's where they diverged. For example, Hitler relied heavily on the SA, the Nazi Party's own little army, to stir up chaos and make people afraid. The goal was to make them believe that only he could bring back order.
Then there's the Reichstag fire.
Huh.
The event that really let Hitler grab absolute power.
And don't forget, a lot of historians are pretty sure the Nazis themselves set that fire.
Now, if that's not a power move, I don't know what is. Makes you realize how fragile our freedoms are, especially when something terrible happens and everyone's scared. Hitler used that fire, used people's fear to justify taking away basic rights and consolidating his power, all under the guise of safety.
The oldest trick in the authoritarian playbook: manufacture a crisis, then ride in on your white horse to save the day.
And in Cuba, Castro took a totally different approach. He rallied support through guerrilla warfare and this whole idea of revolution. And he managed to unite two groups you wouldn't think would get along: rural peasants and city intellectuals, both sick of Batista's corruption. He brought them together under his 26th of July movement.
And you can't forget Radio Rebelde. Castro understood how powerful media could be, even way back then. His radio broadcasts weren't just broadcasting from some hidden jungle outpost. They were sending messages of resistance that resonated internationally. People around the world were hearing about the struggle in Cuba, and it put a lot of pressure on Batista.
Two very different roads, both leading to the same destination, authoritarian rule. It really makes you wonder how much of this was cold, calculated strategy, and how much was just being in the right place at the right time. Were there crossroads where things could have gone in a totally different direction?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And historians are still debating it. If we can figure out those turning points, maybe, just maybe, we can stop the same thing from happening again somewhere else down the line.
Okay, so we've talked about what made these countries vulnerable in the first place and the savvy or maybe just plain ruthless ways these leaders exploited those weaknesses. But what happened next? What happened once they were actually in control? I'm kind of dying to know.
Well, that's where things get even more interesting.
Tell
And
me.
a lot more disturbing, to be honest. See, both of these guys, they promised a new world, a utopia, if you will. But the reality, well, that was a different story. A much darker story, in fact. Yeah, Hitler, with that whole horrifying racial purity ideology, he didn't waste any time. He pushed through policies that systematically persecuted and, well, murdered millions.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of it.
The Nuremberg laws, for example, those weren't just words on paper. They were designed very deliberately to strip Jewish people of everything, their citizenship, their jobs, even just their basic rights as human beings.
It's just bone-chilling how calculated it all was.
One example that always gets me, they made it illegal for Jewish people to even marry or have relationships with anyone considered Aryan. I mean, can you imagine? They were trying to erase an entire group of people. It's
It's
just,
beyond horrific. And what gets me is that in the middle of all this horror, there was this sense of, I don't know, twisted togetherness, this shared purpose, like having a common enemy, even one totally made up, brought them together.
exactly. It's a dark side of human nature, isn't it? That need to belong, to have order, even if it costs you your humanity.
And Castro, he was all about social equality on the surface. But underneath, he was just as ruthless as Hitler when it came to shutting down anyone who disagreed with him.
Right, any whisper of opposition and you were imprisoned, exiled, or worse.
Makes you wonder, can you really separate the good from the bad when it comes to these regimes? Like, yeah, Castro brought in things like land redistribution, literacy programs, universal health care. Those seem like good things, right?
It's a question that still haunts historians and political scientists today. Can we, or even should we, separate the achievements from the methods? Can a noble goal ever justify using brutal tactics? Especially when those tactics involve crushing anyone who speaks out.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's easy to say no from where we're sitting, but
Yeah,
I don't know, it's complicated.
it really is. And it's something to keep in mind with both Hitler and Castro, different as they were. Both regimes, in a way, showed the seductive side of authoritarianism. The promise of simple answers to these huge, messy problems. They offered certainty during a time when everything felt chaotic and scary, but that certainty came with a price.
It's like that feeling when you realize a magic trick is just that, a trick. The illusion's gone, and you're left with the reality, which is usually kind of disappointing. Or in this case, much, much darker.
Right. And it makes you think, how fragile is democracy, especially when people are hurting, when they feel like the system failed them? That's when these promises, even the really bad ones, start to sound tempting, you know?
Cool.
It's not just about a bad economy or shaky politics. It's about trust, about those shared values just falling apart. When people lose faith in their leaders, in their institutions, and even in each other, that's when they're vulnerable. That's when they start looking for someone to blame, and that's when those charismatic leaders can step in with their simple, seductive answers, even if those answers are dangerous.
And those leaders often play on people's existing fears and biases, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. They'll twist reality, create these narratives that confirm what people already think, even if it's not true.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure. We've talked about the conditions that made these countries vulnerable, the crafty tactics their leaders used to grab power, and the harsh realities of what happened under their rule. But before we wrap up, we got to talk about the aftermath, right? Like, what's the lasting impact of all this? What's the legacy of these authoritarian regimes?
Man, that's a question with no easy answers. It's like those ripples you get when you throw a rock in a pond. They just keep going, long after the rock's sunk. These regimes, they echo through generations.
Yeah, the effects linger for a long, long time.
Take Germany, for example. Even today, all these years later, they're still wrestling with the shadow of their Nazi past. I mean, they've really dedicated themselves to facing that history head on, remembering the victims, teaching future generations about what happened, and working to make sure such horrors never happen again. But the echoes of that time, they still linger. There are still people who try to downplay the Holocaust, or even scarier, try to bring back Nazi ideology.
It's like a constant reminder, right? Even when you consciously try to learn and grow from the past, those scars, they don't just disappear overnight.
Exactly. And then you've got Cuba. Their situation is totally different politically speaking, but they're still dealing with the effects of their past too. The communist government, even though it's changed over time, is still in power. Sure, they've made some economic changes here and there, but the legacy of Castro's rule, the silencing of dissent, the limits on personal freedom, that's still shaping Cuban society today.
It really makes you wonder, how does any country truly recover from something like that? How do you balance honoring the past, remembering what happened, with actually moving forward and reconciling? It's like trying to walk a tightrope between those two things.
It's a tough balance to strike, but I think a big part of it is just acknowledging how complicated it all is. There's no single answer, no easy fix. It takes open, honest conversations, being willing to look at yourself and your own biases, and learning from those mistakes of the past.
It's a heavy lesson, for sure, but so important. So let's come back to that question we started with. What is it that makes a society vulnerable to authoritarianism in the first place? What did we learn from looking at Hitler's Germany and Castro's Cuba?
It's rarely just one thing, It's usually a perfect storm of different factors all colliding at once. A bad economy, definitely, but also social unrest, political instability, and maybe the biggest factor of all, a leader, someone charismatic who can use those vulnerabilities to their advantage, someone who can spin a story, a narrative that really speaks to people, especially when they're hurting and looking for answers.
It's about the stories we tell ourselves, right? Both Hitler and Castro, they offered narratives that really resonated with people's anxieties about being left behind, betrayed by the system, looking for someone to blame.
Exactly. They took those fears, those deep-seated anxieties, and they offered simple solutions to really complex problems, and they were good at it. They used propaganda, crafted these narratives that painted a picture of a brighter future, even if that future was built on some pretty terrible things.
It's a scary thought, isn't it? That even now in the 21st century, with all our technology and everything we've supposedly learned, we're still vulnerable to these same patterns. There are still societies at risk and people out there who would happily take advantage.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why it's more important now than ever to be on guard, to be critical thinkers. Don't just accept easy answers or those overly simplistic stories, especially the ones that demonize whole groups of people. We have to be able to spot the warning signs in ourselves and in our communities, and we got to be ready to stand up for those things that make democracy strong. Things like tolerance, empathy, basic human rights.
Those are some powerful words to end on, a real call to action for all of us. If we want to break free from these cycles of history repeating itself, we have to stay engaged, we have to stay informed, and we can't let ourselves be tricked. We have to be willing to speak up when we see injustice, to call out harmful rhetoric, and to really fight for empathy and understanding. Because as we've learned today, the cost of doing nothing, of staying silent, that price is just too high.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The future of democracy really might depend on it.
You said it. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. It's been, eye-opening, to say the least. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into, a pretty dark part of history. But this wasn't just about the past. This was about seeing the patterns, recognizing the warning signs, and realizing that we all have a role to play in building a better, stronger, more resilient future. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.